Thank you very much to the Market Theatre Foundation and to Ishmael Mohammed and his colleagues for making this venue available to us. As a small non-profit organization, ASRI is often stressed for all sorts of things, but luckily we have a very good relationship with the Market Theatre Foundation. If you wish to know more about ASRI, the Awal Socioeconomic Research Institute, you can go onto our website. If you've been on the email receiving end of our invitation, you will be able to see what kind of work we've done. We're going to go directly into this panel. I'm going to briefly introduce the four panelists, and I'll introduce them as they sit from my immediate right. The first panelist is Rustam Kuzain, who's a prize-winning poet and, like me, a recovering academic who sometimes teaches. Rustam has a long history of working on issues of representation in South African culture and politics. He's done work with Chimurenga magazine. He's won awards for his poetry, won the 1995 Nelson Mandela Poetry. He's been invited to several platforms around the world to read that poetry. He's got 2 collections out. I encourage you, I'm not just punting this, to look at them because they are truly useful engagements, productive engagements with the cultural politics of contemporary South Africa over the last 20 years. To his right is Puma Gola, who is a, should we say, professor of African studies and well-known feminist, and has written several books on questions of, among other things, slavery, identity, race, gender, sexuality, and South African cultural politics. She currently holds a position at the University of Fort Hare, having held positions elsewhere in South Africa at the University of the Free State, at Wits University, and has several research degrees from Warwick University, at Max Jacobs Maximilians Universität in Germany, in Nation, and the University of Cape Town. To her right is Liberating, who has a PhD in political science on a topic that escapes me at the moment because I'm middle-aged and old. But she's also well known as a commentator on South African political questions, and some of you may be familiar with her work both in public media. She teaches at the University of Victoria on a variety of courses. Last I checked, they included questions of politics in South Africa, and I think an undergraduate general course in politics and political theory. And then to her right is the last panelist for the day, which is Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman has a very long history in South Africa of researching questions of public policy, democracy, and South African politics. Those of us who've been around for long enough remember some of his work from the South African Review, which we had to read as undergraduates. He has a new book out. He's also written a book which is apparently an exclusive book, and I'm not going to punt it, but look out for it, ask for it, buy it. I'm hint about it. He currently holds a research professorship at the University of Johannesburg. I will now hand over immediately to Rustam, and each panelist will have 7 to 10 minutes to make their opening remarks. If I find connections, I might make a kind of knitting statement at the end before throwing 4 questions to the floor. As I reminded everybody earlier, it is being carried on the ITV Network's Facebook live stream on YouTube, and the SABC is carrying it as well, either on their live stream or potentially also on air. So if we could put our mobile phones on silent or discreet, please. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Rustam.
Do I have to use a microphone? First of all, thanks Angelo and ASRI for inviting me to spread my unorthodox to spread some of my unorthodox views about race and racism. I don't have any answers, of course. I don't have any answers. I don't know how to resolve the moments of acute racism between citizens of South Africa. I don't have any advice about the elections, but what I do want to do is draw a line in the sand around our present obsession with race. And I want to, so I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and we can see where we can go from there. So firstly, I speak from an idealistic position, okay, and that is the position of an anti-racist, rather than the position of a non-racialist. That is, I don't believe that there is such a thing as race. I don't believe that there is such a thing as race, rather than believing that there are different races, so to speak, that should just be treated equally or learn how to get along. I'm very much aware that my position is idealistic and even utopian, that people behave day to day in real life as if there was such a thing as race. That, in other words, in the real world, people behave as if how we look means something. So I'm very much aware that centuries of history have passed and that our everyday lives are shaped nevertheless by this something that does not exist, by this fiction, which is the first point of absurdity I want to note, is that we have allowed our lives to be governed by a fiction. Now my position isn't, I need to make it clear as well, some of the panelists and people here might know that my position comes from a leftist position from the late 70s and 80s. I'm not a Johnny-come-lately to the critique of identity politics. So my critique of identity politics and of race and the use of race, I'm not ignoring that racism exists, but my critique of the way in which the language of race persists is from a leftist position and not a reactionary or conservative position. As an idealist anti-racist, I am of course exhausted by how racism persists, but also, and I think more importantly, by the persistence of racialized language and thinking. That is, by how we grant race such primary and powerful explanatory power. Let me be clear and repeat. I am aware of, and myself almost every day, experience the power of racial thinking, i.e. through, what we call microaggressions of racism, etc. I experience those things. So I'm not suffering from an illusion as to the existence of racism. But I think the persistence is due to the fact that we keep on using the language of race. And here, certainly, I want us to think about how South Africa has approached it, how the South African state and bureaucracy has approached, our administration as citizens of this country post-apartheid. The post-apartheid state has simply taken over the old apartheid state's categories in its endeavors, whether those endeavors are successful or not, but it's taken over the old apartheid state's categories to right the racist injustices of apartheid. I believe this was for the purposes of bureaucratic ease, but that it lacked the foresight and the insight that racial discourse itself will perpetuate racial discourse. Race is an easy, and I would say even a lazy lens or frame through which to view things such as the abuse of power or resource distribution and redistribution. So it's easy to take the apartheid bureaucratic discourse and hierarchies, invert those hierarchies, apply them to resource allocation, call it transformation, and believe that we are correcting or changing the course of apartheid history. But we haven't, because the very foundation of our thinking is still tied up in apartheid thinking and in apartheid language. So it is with irony we should note that in a time that we ascribe so much power to language and discourse, now it's a truism almost, that language shapes your reality or language engenders a certain reality, etc. So it's ironic that at a time when we believe that language plays such a powerful part in the way in which we look at reality, that we are using the old apartheid state's racial discourse. So that language shapes our reality, and that language has an impact on us. It is ironic that we still use the language of race to understand, describe, and analyze our reality. We keep on engendering that reality with a language in which a key term refers to something that doesn't exist. And so my line in the sand, in a sense, would be, you know, racism itself persists because we all still look at the world in terms of races. And I know, you know, people can make snide remarks about people who apparently or idealistically want to be colorblind, but it's not an issue of being colorblind. It's really an issue to understand the fundamentals of how language and discourses are used to make us see the world in a certain way. So an even bigger irony for me, coming from the Western Cape and having been classified variously by the apartheid state as Cape Malay and coloured, for me it's a bigger irony in the context of the times we are in, that when we have become so sensitive to the valences of language, that people have grown comfortable and even proud of the label coloured. I reject this term with utter contempt. I reject it because it is an apartheid category, and I reject it also because, partly inspired by the ideas of Biko. I reject it also because in its very constitution as a part of language, in its deep linguistic sense, it robs me, the word coloured, robs me of my agency. If we think simply on a grammatical level about the difference between the word coloured and the difference between the word black and the difference between the word white, you know, I can point out that the form of the word coloured is also a past participle, which is often used in passive constructions. You know, so I'm waiting for the day when we are going to be talking about blackened South Africans and whitened South Africans. So for me, I know, I mean, it sounds absurd and it sounds funny and everything, but for me, that is a primary reason why I reject the word coloured. Because it is a past participle, it is used in passive constructions, and it robs me of my agency. So that's why I reject the term, and I find it weird that people are now using those terms in the same way that the apartheid state used those terms. So there's if language and discourse are these powerful entities that shape us and our reality, the term, as I said, the term coloured, as I said, is a term that robs its referent of agency and turns the referent into a passive object, something to be acted upon or on rather than a subject with agency. Why should I celebrate a term that robs me of my agency? And I'll stop there. That's my line in the sand.
Good afternoon. It's so good to see so many familiar faces, friends and colleagues in the audience. As someone who left Joburg a year ago but still thinks of myself as someone who left recently. And thank you to Asri for this invitation to think about, I think it works, doesn't it work? Fine. Race. I think we continue to talk about race and to talk about racism for various reasons. Firstly, because although we recognize that race does not exist in the way that we inherit it through the complicated histories of ordering the world and violence that make race a thing that not only organizes the world and traffics certain bodies, but also institutionalizes and authorizes certain kinds of violence. And as a thing that is, that is also authorized by various disciplines in the academy. So we recognize that race is not a real thing. But at the same time, to recognize that race, as race science tells us, or as race science defines it, is not a thing, is very clearly not the same thing as saying race does not exist. It sounds like a contradiction, but it actually isn't. Race both does and does not exist. It does not exist in the way that we inherit it. But it also exists in the ways that we inherit it. Our collective experience over the last 400 years, let's say, in the world, has made race a reality. And so it is possible to speak about, to offer a critique, to continue to offer a critique of race as a construct, as a colonial construct, as a slavocratic construct, as a white supremacist construct, and recognize that race has materiality. And so I often think, and this is not what Rustam is saying, of course, but often in the disciplines, in the cluster of disciplines in which those of us trained in the humanities and social sciences, we often pretend as though once we've talked about race as a social construction, the work of unmaking race in the world is then automatically done. To say that species and all of the vocabulary that comes with race science is a fiction, is a construction that authorizes, that is designed to authorize certain kinds of violence, is not to say that we do not feel race, race does not continue to matter in institutional, not just attitudinal, small, anecdotal ways, but in institutional ways of ordering, not just this country, but the world. So those are very different kinds of things. And of course, while I share as an anti-racist myself, I think it's important to do the work of undoing, to continue in the trajectory of unmaking race and making race not matter. I think it's important to note that for large parts of the globe, in this country, in the world, we continue to feel and experience the realities of race mattering, of race existing. And we continue to think of ourselves as race. And of course, we can approach this in a variety of ways. We can assume that there's something pathological about this. Or we can ask questions that in fact trouble some of our own taken for granted assumptions around, for example, post-millennial or millennials using exactly the same language when they use exactly the same terminology as people did in 1980. So when people use descriptors that are racialized, race identities, refer to themselves and organize in race identities, what else is this recourse to race telling us about the world, about what is real, about what matters? And what is also the aversion, because I mean, we have, it seems to me we have two seemingly contradictory impulses. One, which seems to be a concretizing of speaking about race and speaking in race terms, whether we're speaking in race terms in terms of the political inheritances of the big B, or the kind of radical left traditions, or using categories that come to us from slavery, apartheid, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, or whether we're being invited to simply transcend race. I would argue that the language to transcend race is as much race talk as is the language to insist on speaking about ourselves in race terms. And so for me, as a scholar of race, and as a person who lives who lives the race reality, as we all do, it is important to continue to ask questions about how we talk about race and why we continue to talk about race in the ways that we can, and whether in fact an anti-racist future is possible to create without using the language of race. It seems contradictory because often in lefty, radical black critique, there's this tension. There's a tension that says, well, we have to find a way to undo race without talking, without using the language of race. There's also a position, of course, equally from the same tradition that's espoused by people like David Dean, for example, and Grace Nichols, from elsewhere in the Black world, from the Caribbean, for example, and Black British, who argue that there are ways in which to speak about race is more than to simply recite a litany of victimization. Having inherited a world that is race, that is marked by race, that is defined by race, is it accurate to speak, to proceed as though there is only one way to speak about race, and all ways of speaking about race, of speaking race, of using race language, do the same kind of work, are all destructive, are all in service of a racist world? Are we really only doing race talk through the categories that we inherit in dangerous ways? Is this true? So when people are identifying as colored, let's say, are they only speaking about coloredness in the most conservative way of speaking about that coloredness? Does in fact the scholarship post-apartheid on differences within blackness not suggest that something messier and more complicated is going on? Are there, in fact, new ways that are using old vocabularies but doing slightly different work? Is it possible for those of us in this country, in the world, to continue to feel the felt effects of racism, of white supremacy, structures and histories, to speak in ways that are not partly invested in that language of race? Of course, it's important to think about how we speak about race, because language creates, even when we pretend it simply describes. We risk constantly the danger of re-inscribing precisely that which we try to undo. But I think that the language and the ways of speaking, the questions about how we speak about race are not finished. And I think in a world where other inequalities are highlighted, are amplified through race, it seems premature to think that we can have a transformative or decolonial or radical vocabulary that avoids race. But how do we speak anti-racism while using the language of race? And these are questions that it seems to me we're being asked every day. We're being asked this is the endurance of race talk. The endurance of race talk is because race continues to be very real. Race continues to be negotiated. Race continues to be under question in conflictual and mutually reinforcing ways. But also because, of course, we continue to assume that only certain behaviors and information and circuits of meaning are about race. We don't ask questions about who can speak about race and which forms of speaking about race are seen to be race talk and which are seen to be about gender and not race. So, for example, as we speak about the election specifically, what does it mean that when male political party leaders speak about power, speak about distribution, speak about where we live in ways that continue to be very racist, they are assumed to be speaking about race. But when we speak about who has access to certain kinds of toilets, who has access to safety in the city, who has access to sanitary protection, that is not seen as race talk too. Is it possible to speak about class, to speak about gender, to speak about desire, to speak about the world we want to create in South Africa without, or in the world right now, because it seems in many ways that as the world moves, globally, much of the world seems to move right. It feels almost to me, as a child brought up in apartheid, under apartheid, it feels almost like the Reagan, Thatcher years are upon us again in the world. Is it possible then to interrogate the work that race does at the same time that we see, in ways that do not use race language, at a time when we're seeing race crystallize, when we're seeing the move to the right globally across Europe, parts of Latin America, on our own continent. Which race talk is race talk? Who can speak for race? These are important questions as well. What race work, what race talk is happening as we approach the elections? Who speaks about power and transformation? Just before I finished teaching in the city, at a university not very far from where we sit today, one of my students came in. I mean, this happened several times, but I'll share this anecdote and I'll wrap up on that. I won't comment on it. My apologies to those of you who've heard me share this anecdote in the past. So I arrive at an 8 o'clock class, and we're talking about power and navigating the city and in specific bodies that are raced and classed and gendered and read in certain ways, but also inhabit certain agencies or perform certain agencies that are embodied. One of the undergraduate women in my class says, part of living as raced and gendered and classed and sexualized in contemporary South Africa for her is that by the time she arrives in my classroom at 8 a.m., she has fought at least 15 battles in ways that people who are very differently positioned can't even imagine. And she says, I walk out of my house, and this is an experience that will be familiar to many, certainly to the black women in the audience, but I think it will be familiar beyond that. It is an act of sheer will to walk from my house to the transport, the first port of transport. Negotiating, getting onto that transport is raced and gendered and sexualized. What happens on which kinds of transport are available to me is raced and gendered and classed. What happens on the mode of transport, how many times I have to change, what happens between walking between the city center and this campus, right? And of course, and we speak about this in this country, and we say, oh my goodness, it's the stuff that women go through. It's the stuff that women go through, and we think about, and we are able to think about it as gendered work that has nothing to do with race. When we think of systematic, institutionalized, or personalized attack on, let's say, a black man's body by a non-black man, by which I mean a white man, or a white woman, or, yes, so I'm using black in the legal sense always, in the black consciousness sense, so the big B, not the small b. We assume that that is a race, that attack is about race. And yet we think about the systematic, ongoing, daily, not microaggressions, but perpetual violence on poor people, on poor people of all genders, on women and gender non-conforming people, as anything but race. And so it seems to me that it is quite premature to start thinking about transcending race and thinking about who we are and what to do and how to undo power without talking about race, and when we continue to avoid facing the work that race does in intersecting ways, but also who we think is doing the work of speaking about race. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Dr. Mbed.
Sure. Okay, so much to digest. And thank you so much to Asri for inviting me to be here, and to my fellow panelists who've spoken before me. for really giving so much food for thought. And from when I first had the discussion with Angelo about this a few weeks ago, thought about it quite narrowly, actually, within the context of South Africa and the South African election, and the ways in which race and actually not even race itself, but racialization and being gendered and being sexualized were going to play into this election and this election campaign. Since then, there's been a lot that's happened that sort of provoked a lot of discussion around this issue of race beyond just the South African election within my own mind. So I'm going to try and join sort of two separate sets of thought as I talk very quickly here. The first is that, you know, when I first thought about this, and I wrote my dissertation on South Africa's 2 terms in the UN Security Council in 2007, 8, and 2011, 2012. And one of the things that came across very profoundly in the statements that were being made by both the South African government and others from the Global South, but also in some of the debates that were going on, you'll remember that in the first term, we started it under a Bush government, and then Barack Obama won the election. And then in the second term, Barack Obama was the US president, and there were issues around Palestine that played up, but then that was also when Muammar Gaddafi got murdered. And a lot of the language and a lot of the misunderstanding, it seemed, and the points of tension and conflict amongst the powers in the Security Council was deeply raced. It was conflicts that were coming from different parts, from different historical contexts, that when you brushed away and brushed away and brushed away were fundamentally about the way in which the people who were having that conversation and the nations they came from had been racialized historically in global history. And it kept bringing me back then to that W.E.B. Du Bois quote from the early 19th century, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he said that in the early 1900s, and the problem of race, the problem of the color line, was never resolved in the course of the 20th century. And there was a period of time from the 1990s and South Africa's freedom, so the democratic moment of 1994, falls very much within this narrative of the problem of race was solved. You had the end of communism, the end of big colonial questions, freedom of apartheid, freedom of South Africa from apartheid, which had come to, in international conversation, come to really symbolize the problem of the color line being the problem of the 20th century. And it come to symbolize that in ways that got a lot of other people off the hook. So the Americans didn't have to think about their race problems if they were being nice to the ANC and the PNC or whoever. Neither did the Swedes. The Dutch didn't have to think about their race history when they were busy hiding and, you know, really supporting the liberation struggle, and didn't have to think about the deep racism that's at the foundation of their society. So when South Africa then gains non-racial democracy and one vote for all, there's this notion that, well, we've resolved racism in the world. And what we're waking up to in 2019 is that, hell no, you didn't. You didn't fix it in South Africa, but neither did you deal with it in the rest of the world. In the past 24 hours, you've had old Angelo, the Italian gangster, in the Zondo Commission, proudly admitting, or not proudly, whatever he was doing, that he's racist. A few hours later, you had an American TV star, Jussie Smollett, who's African American and gay be beaten brutally by a bunch of white men shouting, "Make America Great Again," who called him nigger and put a noose around his neck. For all intents and purposes, it looks like a failed lynching. The day before, you had a whole hoo-ha in Australia, if you think about Australia, and some woman on a TV show going off about Aborigines. The point I'm making is that in as much as race is scientifically made up, it has been fundamental to the socioeconomic experience of the majority of people in the world for 400 years. And as such, is fundamental to the socioeconomic histories of people living in the world in 2019, and informs the way in which they experience the world, but also the way they identify with themselves and relative to others. And the main issue around that, around the impact of those socioeconomic histories, is that race was never just a descriptive construct concerned with phenotypes, right? It's not just about your nose is broad, your hair is puffed, your skin is pale, whatever. You burn easily in the sun. That's not what it's about. It's about assigning value to human beings for the purposes of production and of social organization. And the values that have been historically attached to race still persist. And they still inform the quality of life, the number of opportunities, the political choices, the choices in terms of movement. Ask anyone sitting on some island in Greece waiting to go into the European Union. The value we attach to race has not changed in 400 years. And given the intersection of race and class and gender and race as a fundamental unit for economic organization. If you look historically, the development of race happens parallel to the development of global capitalism. That's not incidental. It was deliberate, it was necessary. And as we are seeing global capitalism at its pinnacle, at its most perverse place, in its most perverse iteration, we are seeing racism and race questions across the world re-emerge in their most perverse iterations. So the genocide that you're seeing in Myanmar of the Rohingya people is raced. It's not just about religion. The rise of the white right in the United States, and according to the CIA, white nationalists are the biggest threat to US security. They far surpass ISIS or the remnants of Al-Qaeda. The highest number of terrorist incidents on US soil since 2001 have been by white nationalists. And so when we talk about race, to talk about it just as being about sort of, you don't like me because I'm black or white or whatever, I think is problematic. So bringing that back then to the South African context. I think that we are seeing, and we will see with this election, and we've seen a reanimation of race and racial language in our electoral discourse. It's always been there. But where people didn't want to use explicitly language of race to describe things, they are now. And in a way that's sort of similar to what we're seeing globally, I think that it's because of the fundamental failure of our economic system. That as people, and as the value of life that people live, and the disparities are being entrenched on racial terms, the language used to fight that and to try to understand that will be racial/racist. For me, this is nowhere more obvious than in the way we speak of foreign Africans. It's easy to think of our internal black-white debates, and I thought it was very interesting how many young black people, and I'm including myself in this, I was so relieved when, I believed Angelo Grisi more after he said he was racist than I did before. Because it's easier to get blood out of a stone than to get a white person to admit he was racist. So if he'll admit that, I believe him on the rest of it. So often there's so much that is about our sort of interpersonal relationships as blacks and whites in this country, and I use black broadly. But for me, the way in which we, and all of us, and I include all South Africans here, treat and talk about and think about foreign Africans is very telling about the deep-seated racism at the core of our social interaction. And so for black people who still feel like we're at the bottom of the food chain, the competition of another set of people in your same category, hell no. And this goes, I know that black professionals will often be like, he, when there's been a service delivery protest or xenophobic protest or whatever in townships. But listen to black professionals speak at universities about other Africans, or in banks, or in consulting firms. We all speak about foreign black people in the same way, as threats. White South Africans either speak about foreign black Africans as a menace, as dirt. Listen to the ways in which the DA leadership will speak, well, starting with old colonials, the colonels, will speak about the city center, for example. We speak about it in cleanliness, in pathological terms, disease that needs to get treated. Or they speak about it in comparative terms of better blacks than others. But fundamentally, it's still race. And as we've seen from the DA, from the EFF, and we're seeing it from the ANC as well, the issue of the issue of migration and securing the borders is going to play out very strongly in the next 4 months. And I anticipate that it's going to be used a lot as race proxy. Finally, I think and I hope, as a political scientist, and Prof. Friedman next to me, I hope agrees, even though you wouldn't call yourself a political scientist. South African political science has had this whole obsession with like racial census, that South African elections are a racial census. People vote for different parties according to their race. And the 2016 election actually showed that black South African voters are a lot more sophisticated than their white counterparts. The DA had a pretty much 95%, and I pulled out the stats from Port Elizabeth, where if you overlaid the election results with Stats SA results, so you looked for a majority white area or majority white ward, like with a 95% white population, which there are, the DA would get 95%. Whereas there was a great deal more diversity in townships. And in the areas where the DA did manage to make serious gains, Nelson Mandela Bay and then Apple screwed that up, and Johannesburg, Tshwane, a lot of that work was done by black voters. And so I hope that, so my point then is twofold. Firstly, that race is as important as it ever was in our social and our political interaction. But the racial census view of South African elections and South African electorate is flawed and incorrect and non-factual. And I hope we'll be able to have a more nuanced conversation about the relationship between race and elections in South Africa.
Well, I guess the good news is that my colleague called me old and not ancient, so I'm winning. Okay. Before I talk about the topic, I do have to issue a health warning, and the health warning is that I'm very glad that the chair mentioned my book. I did mention this in connection with my last book. I readily admit that there is no statistical evidence that you will be struck by lightning if you don't buy my book. On the other hand, there is no statistical evidence that you will not be struck by lightning if you don't buy the book. And therefore, the prudent person, to avoid being struck by lightning, will go out tomorrow and buy a copy of the book. Okay, now let me talk about the topic. The book is called Power in Action. Anyway, there you are. I've got two people. Okay, look, I thought I was being incredibly cunning here because I wanted to go last because I thought everybody's going to say things which I can brilliantly put down, etc. And this totally backfired because my last two colleagues have said all the things that I wanted to say. So I'm going to build on what they said in a different way. And then I am going to talk about the election because that was what I was briefed to do. And essentially, just the headline before I go into some of the theoretical stuff, etc. What I want to argue about the election is that we will be getting two kinds of messages from political parties in the election. And we will be getting messages from political parties who talk about race by talking about it, and we will be getting messages from political parties who talk about race by not talking about it. And I want to suggest at the end that all the political parties, in a sense, are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. But just to put what my two academic colleagues have been saying in context and to support them. Rustam says he comes from the 70s to 80s radical generation. I mean, I come from the sort of early 70s radical generation, so they were children when we did this stuff. But the point that I think is very relevant is that when we were radicals in the early 70s, it was absolutely compulsory, and it ran right through the university system, that you had to argue that race was simply a consequence of capitalism, that race had no meaning at all except as a way of masking the economic domination of people who owned property over others. What I want to argue, and that's where Rustam and I would no doubt part company, is that we were profoundly wrong. That we got the whole thing profoundly wrong. And the reason I believe we got it profoundly wrong, to try to put in context what both of my colleagues have been saying, in both the book I just published and the previous one, my major concern is to try to understand domination. understand how human beings dominate each other and exercise power over each other and how we can change them. And it seems to me that race is a far more powerful force of domination in the world today, for many of the reasons that my two colleagues mentioned, than class is. The one standard explanation, well, one standard response you get from this is you say, well, they say race is only a social construct. Well, of course, race is only a social construct. There's no biological basis to race at all. But class is also a social construct. All the things that divide us in society are social constructs. And the question is, what are the powerful social constructs, and what are the social constructs that lead to domination? And it seems to me, and that's why I think we were so wrong, that very often what appears to be an expression of economic domination or expression of class domination is actually an expression of a desire for racial domination or support for racial domination. My two colleagues have mentioned the status of the world today. I don't think we're back in the Thatcher and Reagan era at all. I think that we're in something far more dangerous than the Thatcher and Reagan era. Essentially, what we are involved in at the moment as a species is a situation across the planet in which groups who have been used to dominating, without having that domination seriously challenged, feel that their domination is under threat. And they're behaving that way. The incident you described seems to me to illustrate this perfectly. Make America great again means make America white again. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Bolsonaro wants to destroy the rainforests not only because he's going to make money, but because indigenous people live in the rainforest. He wants to destroy indigenous people. Men rape women consistently and in much higher numbers than a lot of other places in many parts of India, because in those parts of India men have dominated women for centuries and are frightened by the fact that you now have Indian women making a major impact in politics and the divisions, etc. So that is the reality with which we sit. And very often, as I say, what appears to be racial, what appears to be class-based is racial. If those of you who study political economy as I did, you were probably told, oh, you have all these theories about capitalist development, etc. What does not appear, as far as I know, in very many of these books, is that the greatest source, by a considerable margin, of today's prosperity in North America and Western Europe is the Atlantic slave trade and plantation slavery. You could not have had the economic growth you had if black people were not literally enslaved and sent to die in plantations in order to generate surpluses for Europe and North America. In our own context, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that there's for those of you who are interested in political science, there's a wonderful book which has just come out, which I think maybe will be Book of the Year, because I really think the author's made a major contribution. It's called Race and the Making of American Political Science by Jessica Black. And what she makes, I mean, without going through it, the point she makes, which I find very compelling, is that the early political scientists in America were very reactionary, very conservative. They wanted to make sure that politics was controlled by academics and by professionals rather than by the people. And that's always been understood as simply a sort of run-of-the-mill form of conservatism. Actually, what was really unraveling there, particularly John William Burgess, who was the first of them, and Burgess, incidentally, was the Angelo Grisi of political science. He made no bones about the fact that he thought black people were inferior. But what was really making Burgess feel that we had to clamp down and make sure that democracy was stopped was that after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, one of the things the northern states did after Lincoln, etc., in order to make a point, I guess, was to make sure that at least for a period there were black-run administrations in the southern states which had practiced plantation slavery. And that's what Burgess was distraught about. He was distraught about if you let this thing happen, you would have blacks, and in Burgess's world it wasn't only blacks, it was Italians, it was all sorts of people who weren't white Anglo-Saxons coming into his space and taking them over. In this country, very often, when people talk about privatization, for example, what are they actually saying? it comes across as some sort of ideological preference for the market over the state. Very often what it means is we want civilized white people in the private sector to run the state rather than barbaric black people in the public sector. And there's a whole set of consequences which flow from that. Now let me relate that to the election and to the political space. Well, the obvious first point to make, which I'm very glad Dr. Vetter made because it's crucial, is that I don't know of a single political party. I thought maybe the new left-wing party might be one of them, but Mr. Bivey's out there telling us that we must be scared of Sudanese people and Muslims and all sorts of other folk we seem to have a problem with. I don't know, because of what Mr. Bivey said the other day, whether there's going to be a single political party in this contest saying anything at all democratic and anything at all humane about people from the rest of the continent and people from the rest of the world. There seems to be a consensus among the political class at the moment that the way in which you establish your credentials is that you trash immigrants and you trash people from elsewhere. And I think that that will be a major feature of the campaign. As far as the message of the parties themselves, well, obviously when I talk about parties talking about race by not talking about race, if you look at what I've been saying about domination and about power, etc., I think that the DA's slogan really sums up a lot of what I'm trying to say. A South Africa for all, okay. And what a South Africa for all is actually code for is, let's just pretend, folks, let's pretend there's no racial domination, no power dynamics. We won't talk about that stuff for the next 10 years. We'll all pretend that the last 300 years didn't happen and that nobody exerts power over anybody else in the private realm and in the economy and in the academy and in all the other places in which the same hierarchies which existed before 1994 exist in slightly modified form. So in other words, that is a message which goes down very well with the racial power holders who want to believe that, in fact, their world is entirely colorblind. And if I can be indulged for 10 minutes, I mean, I thought so, a very revealing experience of just how this stuff works the other day, which I'm going to write some more about later on, which is that it happened to affect a family member of mine who got attacked verbally, by a really hardcore racist because he had called him out in one of the newspapers, etc. And the family member concerned also happens to double as a comedian. And what this guy did, the racist, no, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, so the racist totally distorts an anti-racist video that he made, and says it's actually about exalting foreign murders, etc. And then all these fellow racists get very excited, and they put all sorts of Nazi stuff out there. It's literally Nazi stuff, not, we hope Hitler come back and burn you, etc. The local DAMP sees this. His first response is to apologize for the comedian to the racist and say, terribly sorry, we don't make fun of foreign murders. Okay. Which means that the official opposition has a candidate who feels that a hardcore racist who literally on his chat room has pictures of black people as baboons, that he is a far more reliable source of information than anybody else, okay? And just to end the story, in case you won't be out, I have been trying since the 20th of December to elicit a response from Mr. Maimane on this issue, and he's not interested. And I do not believe he's not reading the emails. I believe that he's in a situation where if he actually says that it is unacceptable to support a man who has that kind of attitude to black people, that he would lose, what he's so afraid of losing support among his suburban base. Now that is what a South Africa for all is really about, okay? Let's make South Africa safe for people who paint black people like baboons. As far as the ANC and the EFF are concerned, to the major other parties, they will of course talk about race consistently. But I think we really have to ask ourselves whether the way in which they're talking about race really takes us forward. And to me, it only takes us forward if it is proposing a clear alternative to domination and the illegitimate use of power. And I don't think it is. I mean, the ANC's position on this is clearly discredited because the ANC has now been in power for 25 years. And my biggest problem with the ANC, besides the other stuff, which is very topical at the moment, is if you look at 25 years of ANC governance, it has never, ever produced any kind of serious, coherent plan to dismantle racial domination. It has never actually put anything out there to say, look, this is what the problem is and this is what we want to do about it. And in effect, it is, whether deliberately or indirect, it has found racial domination in a sense kind of useful because it's something you can trot out in order to whip up support at election time because it speaks to the experiences of the majority of the electorate, and then you don't have to answer too many questions about why you haven't done anything about it. The EFF, who, as far as I'm concerned, is really just a sort of disenchanted family relative of the ANC, has exactly the same perspective, but simply takes it to the next degree, okay? And assumes that you can sort of dissolve in slogans 300 years of domination. So what we will not get out of, what we will get out of this election is a great deal of race denialism out of the official opposition. A great deal of rather cynical race manipulation from the ANC and the EFF. And what we will not get out of this election is any coherent discussion of how we start to dismantle 300 years of racial hierarchy in this country.
Since I started, and my ideas were 7 minutes, I used 7 minutes, and I've now had heard a couple of jibes against some of the stuff that I said. I thought I should respond because I do think that the issue is about power and domination. Okay, but where does that power and domination come from? Okay. We've now had 50 years of racial, of anti-racist and feminist critiques of patriarchy and domination and oppression, and nothing has changed. People are able to dominate you and to oppress you because they are materially stronger than you are. They have more money. All of the critiques of discourse is not going to change that power relationship. And you can joke about what Marxists used to believe in the 70s, etc. They were bloody right. Okay? As long as you don't change the material relationships of power and domination, it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. If you go to Indonesia, if you go to many post-colonial countries, you will see that the state and the rich and capital oppress the poor. Whether we have the same religion or whether we speak the same language, whether we come from the same genealogy, doesn't fucking matter. Because as long as someone has more guns than you have, more money than you have, more physical power than you have, they are going to dominate you. The question is, how do you change that? And you're not going to change it by discussing the discursive elements of that domination. You are only going to change it if you actually fucking challenge the material basis of the power relationships in society. Thank you.
Okay, what I wish to do now is provide a kind of link to the audience so that you can ask some questions. And I think we began with questions of language and construction. But race is constructed in language because this is what all the panelists agree is how you reproduce race. I do think it's important to draw a distinction between the administrative use of race, or race as administration, looking at the world, organizing the world, and analyzing the world, because those are two different operations, and one separates them for the purposes of clarity. I also think it's important to remind ourselves that it is a question of agency. whether it's the question of individual agency, how we define ourselves versus how we are defined. And classical, critical race theory defines this as a distinction between ascription, how others define you, and self-identification, how you think of yourself. And there, power and material resources play a very important role. You may think of yourself as a particularly good tap dancer. You go on X Factor, and the judges tell you you are not, and they have the power and the resources to do so. And similarly, in race terms, there are all sorts of ways we would like to think ourselves or unthink ourselves. And yet there is an administrative, state, or capital power mechanism that redefines us in violation of how we think of ourselves. This is not just a local issue, as all four of the panelists have pointed out. This is a global issue. It has regional consequences for how we think of ourselves as South Africans in Africa, how we think of ourselves as Africans in the world, and when and how those two operations contradict one another. I have a very, very well-trod old dine out on this story of the late apartheid news broadcast weather forecast in English. And what they would do is the South African provinces, or four of them at the time, and then suddenly he would go, and now for our viewers traveling to Africa. And the question in my mind was always, is the Limpopo River like the Indian Ocean? Is South Africa so exceptional that we are not Africans, right? And I think that that sense of exceptionalism has bled into post-apartheid South Africa, as many other forms of unfinished business have. And we've also been slightly shaped, well, not that, we've also been shaped by knowledge production questions. So Stephen talks about the way in which the tradition and discipline of politics and political science has itself erased history. All disciplines, as Pumla has pointed out, has the same kinds of histories of where we can trace back. Whether you're reading English literature, teaching mathematics, understanding the way in which you do chemistry, all of these have very particular race histories in this country. And here I think the global political economy is important. So I'm thinking here of people like Winthrop and Jordan, and also somebody like Michael Banton, who says if you want to talk about race, you have to place it in relation to other issues that are contemporary in the moment that you talk about race. The history is important, but as all four of the panelists have pointed out, the present is also important, because there's a specific global political economy that race is being articulated in today. And then lastly, I agree with the panelists in all sorts of forms, but I think how I would articulate it is that while race isn't real in the scientific sense, I think of it like a ghost. It has real effects. So here I'm thinking of the opening lines of Richard Dyer's book on whiteness in representation, where he says, who gets bombed, who gets aid, who does not get bombed. You cannot pretend that race does not play a role in how those decisions are made. And I think Stibele made a very clear point of how that plays out in supranational organizations like the United Nations. But they also play out, as Stephen has pointed out, as Pumla has shown up, and as Rustin has pointed out, in everyday interactions. Right? How you get served in a cafeteria, whether or not you're able to buy a house, whether you move into a neighborhood, or whether you're read as a potential hijacker or not, or whether you're read as a potential threat or not. And it's not just at the individual level, it also happens at the group level. And here critical race theorists like Katie McIntosh, who Frankenberg have pointed out, that we often talk about black people as belonging in groups, but of white people as individuals. And you'll hear this in the political rhetoric coming out of parties. So some parties will argue that no, we should be judged as individuals and on individual merit. Erase race. Others will argue that no, as Stephen has pointed out, there'll be a cynical argument about you should think about this as groups. What I think we want to hear from the audience is how you engage with the four participants. They will then, in their responses to you, also respond to one another. And as I said, I'm providing a bridge here. If you can keep your questions to 30 seconds or less. So we'll take question 1, 2, 3, 4, and to the side. So we'll take a round of four questions first, and then come back.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Lesego Tau. I'm an author and a human development practitioner. I deal on issues of psychosocial matters. So I work with a group of psychologists and social workers. My deposit are very soft. It's just 2 points very quickly. The first one I would say, racism is a scripted ideology to keep wealth trapped in one racial group. Now, my passion in particular is on research. We have found out that born-frees, they want to coexist. They want to live in harmony, in unison, as one group. As black people, white, colored, and they're here. We want to coexist with these other groups. But somebody is always sponsoring the script to keep this racial separation and to always fuel it to always exist. So what I'm saying is that parents, I would rightfully put it like this: post-apartheid, though that existed then, you have failed us. Because you carry the resources to always fuel this racial separation. I'm saying young people are the ones to decide how they want to answer this question, because politicians are busy scripting it. It has to always be alive. Through the research that we always make with these young people, they want to be amongst themselves. A young person does not mind being with a black person unless a parent says it's wrong to be with this one. So hence I'm rightfully saying parents have failed these young people. And there's an issue again where Indians and colors have separated themselves from this racial subject. When you ask a young person now through a research project, what is racism? Black and white hating each other. That's what they know. I'm saying until Indians and colors see themselves as part of the solution, then we'll be able to be in the position where we say we need to address the matter of racism. Indians and colors needs to be in the party, and I'm saying parents, you need to stop it. Stop fueling this script. It can end. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. I think your talks were quite interesting, and it gives us some other ideas of how we can cross-examine you. My views are such that I believe South Africa was founded on corporate mentality. The Dutch East India Company. And I don't think that has really left us in terms of who we are. Question here is this, that colonization plays a card in terms of how they see the idea of oppression, and oppression can have many different variations, and race is one of them. My view is this, that if you become free, what are you doing? Are you looking now at the question of unity of South Africa, or rather the idea of now catching the joker in terms of what is corporatization and entering the scope of what was capitalism in the idea of a liberal constitution relates to the fact that now we can all have peace. And the idea of peace was such that the margins were left out completely, in my opinion. In fact, the government, who was supposed to represent the margins, didn't know the idea of decolonization, if I may add to our academics here. The idea of decolonization is not properly understood, because the scholars would say, if René Descartes, who's a philosopher, says, "I think, therefore I am," he's actually referring himself to be a white man that he thinks that he is. That means whoever is after that, comes after that, will relate to the idea of industrial revolution based on the fact of capitalism, of who the white I is. Now, how are you going to overcome that view, dear panel? Second thing is, how are you going to deliver to the margins based on the fact that capitalism is not a solution? Capital is, but not capitalism. So if you look at the idea of the Gramscian view of the subaltern, and I must quickly say that there are very complexities of the word subaltern. Have we become the subaltern? Are we now mimicking someone in terms of who the ANC was? Because that's the party we were wanting to vote for deliberately. Is a subaltern now the idea that you just grab whichever Louis Vuitton bag of 300,000 in cash when you can? Is this the idea of delivery to the idea of those that are on the margins? Because you see, racism will not go away if the leaders you choose, in terms of uniting the country, sure, in view of what is decolonization, in view of the kind of actors that are out there, which are the capitalists, the social unions, and the political actors, and us, all our citizens, that we don't recognize ourselves as African, we will remain in the racist idea of that competition. Can you please give some future perspectives to what I'm talking about in terms of what is decolonization? Thank you very much.
My name is Madalitso Piri. I'm a doctoral candidate at please. I have two questions to Professor Friedman specifically. You did speak about the fact that you got some of the things wrong. What I don't hear in your analysis is the use of white supremacy and anti-black racism itself as an analytical category. How does that actually, how do we move to that, to think of, you spoke about domination, but not only as a form of a kind of race talk, but to think of systems, to think of the race itself as a category that goes beyond the capitalist epoch that you speak about. The second question has to do with the idea of the nation state that some of the, I think Stay alluded to it on the panel. So I just want, Mamdani has argued that the state itself is a racialized creation. So beyond all of these, to say, oh, and I speak as a foreign national proudly, so the culture talk, like, what are your views in terms of the futures of the South African state? What do you see? Is it a reversal of the colonial formations? Is it an idea of some supranational state that is beyond the current borders, which when we're thinking of elections in the contested boundaries, those seem to be the issues that are being discussed and not the concerns that other people bring into it. So I just want your thoughts around that. Thanks.
Could I please remind people to keep their questions as short as possible? We are busy running out of time.
My name is Marcus Jacobs. I'm an author of the book Living Solutions. Just on a lighter note, someone there mentioned, I don't know if it's the first time I heard the word coloredness. And I was trying to work out, is coloredness a new way of saying that about, a lifestyle of being colored or way of being? Maybe when my wife is speaking at home, I should say to her, stop that coloredness. I just wanted to put that in because, we use words and sometimes it can just go a little out of tangent. But for me, there's nothing wrong. When my daughter was little, and I love the academic perspective, and I'm sure and see it's very important, but I just want to bring it from a more practical level. When my daughter was small, and I want to just ask the panel what their thoughts are on it. We were walking in a park, and an Afrikaans guy came and he said to her, you klipkop, Busman, huh? And whatnot. So my daughter says to me, Daddy, what does klipkop mean? So I say to her, klipkop means someone with a strong, sturdy way of thinking. What I'm trying to say here is we on the ground can change the perspective of how we see things and how we relate to it. Instead of me saying that man and saying all the bad things about what he's trying to create and the perception he's trying to create, I created a perception in her. And I said, listen, you are not your body, you're not your eyes, you're not the way your hair. You are bigger, you are better than that. Sure. You are more bold than that, you're more stronger than that. You are mortal, yet immortal. Don't look at the mortality, look at the immortality, and not meaning life and death. Almost like Alexander Pope said, with too much knowledge for the skeptic side, with too much wisdom for the Stoic side. He hangs between endowed to act and rest, endowed to deem himself a god or beast. How do we see ourselves? And how to create a perspective within her, which today my daughter has managed to ingrain that perspective in her. The place she works is dominated by male domination, is dominated previously by white domination, but she manages to forge through it. So, here's my thing. Is it about race, or is it about relationships? The thing that I say there is we are diverse. We don't focus on unity in racial diversity. We focus on harmony despite diversity.
We're now going to hand over to the panelists, who each have, I'm afraid, 2.5 minutes to respond to a component of any of the questions that you wish to, so that we can take a last round of questions immediately after. And really, from now on, if I raise this, it means your time is up and I'm going to cut you off.
I just want to reiterate my issue about power and domination. You asked the question, why do only certain people get bombed? Okay? They get bombed because they don't have bombs to bomb the other fuckers. Okay, I'm sorry that I'm using profanities, but the issue of power is a material issue. Class is not a social construct. Class is an objective thing. You can measure it. You can say, this person earns 12,000 Rand a month, this person earns 150,000 Rand a month. This person earns 300 Rand a week. Okay, we can say, okay, people who earn only 300 Rand a week must be having a terrible life. It's objectively measurable. They can't buy a basket of decent food. It's all objective. Why is that so? Why is that so in a country like South Africa? Why is that so in post-apartheid South Africa? How is that related to discursive issues of which race is an element? How? Of course, in South Africa, most abjectly poor people are black people. That is our history. But they are not poor, they are not powerless because they are black. They are powerless because they don't have access to the resources that we as the middle classes have access to. We have to ask the question, how do we change that? Do we change that by asking Penny Sparrow not to be a racist? Is that how we're going to change that? That's a rhetorical question.
Okay, so I think two quick things. One.
Stop swearing.
I know we're broadcasting, but I think in the late 90s, several men and women in the radical black consciousness tradition had a lot to say about language and profanity. It's on record, you can look it up. It's part of what some of us spent our 20s studying. So, quickly, let me come at this tangentially. The DA 2018 is South Africa for All. I'm sure I'm not the only person who also hears the ANC 1994, A Better Life for All. In that. And I'm not saying by that DA is copying the ANC. That's too lazy and too simple. I'm saying something else about ostensibly very different treatments of race, but that are actually saying the same kind of thing, that are assuming that we can create a certain things and what that all looks like, and diversity and unity and tolerance and all of those kinds of things, which, The second thing I want to say very quickly is I'm not convinced that born frees want to coexist, but someone else is fueling racial separation. First of all, I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and I mean, about post-apartheid South Africa. Okay, we have a lot of reason to beat ourselves up, but we also, I mean, I just think that some of the ways in which we use language that is as in frighteningly and beautifully aspirational ways exists as much in Rainbow Nation as it does in this coinage of born free. You know, I think it's like a significant misnomer. Are born frees born free? Really? That's the first thing. The second thing is, one of the most radical movements that we've seen in this country, the decolonial movement, the fallist movement, Fees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, those are supposedly born frees, right? And they're saying, sorry, class matters, race matters, gender matters, where we live matters, history matters. I don't know. I'm not hearing we want to coexist and hold hands, but you old people are boring us. And I'm hearing the opposite. I'm hearing we want to look at the contradiction and the lies. And I'm hearing them saying, actually, you old people were all tired. And I mean, I'm an old person, I was tired. Okay, I was 21, I was grown up in 94. I am tired. Yes, I want to live in a, if there was a post-race place in the world, I would live there because I'm over it. But it doesn't exist. And I think part of what these people who are supposed to be born free are telling us in all of their movements, social movements that we ignored when they were by poor blacks, that we criminalized, that people were being tortured by the very state that is supposed to make them free, right? So Fees Must Fall is visible, but it's a continuation of many, many, many other movements by young people and intergenerational and transgenerational. But young people are the backbone of those movements who are saying, actually, you old people, like you tired, now you want to live in your, that's very nice. However, this is the reality and you need to be radicalized or re-radicalized, and you know, maybe stretch in ways that we don't always think are radical as well. So I don't know. So when I look at the movements, when I look at the activity, even those places that we're saying are not political, by these people that you're calling born frees, it says to me something else. That's one thing. Second thing is, you didn't say this, but I have to say this. So in South Africa, and this is my last thing, in South Africa, everybody's obsessed with this thing, which is our history contradicts it. This notion that if you throw together this basket of races, all as kids, if white kids grow up with black kids, then they're not going to be racist. Really? If you have black and white people in intimate settings, then automatically, the only reason all of us are so hung up on race is because we grew up separately. We are apartheid children, and we're making our children apartheid children. Really? So if you create intimacy across races, even if you're talking in the boring four things that are supposed to be races that come from apartheid and whatever, whichever use of race, if you just throw them together, then they'll transcend, because familiarity and intimacy. Really? Really? We also have to be the most ahistorical people on the planet if we really believe that. When did we ever not have intimacy? Who raised white kids? Yes. Yeah. Who raised white kids in this country? You had intimacy. And you could still go to the border. You could still be a National Party legislator. So it is not true that if you throw people together when they're young, automatically, intimacy is an automatic antidote to anti-racism, to racism. The history of this country, in fact, shows that we have to do the work. It is a lazy and irresponsible thing to continue to circulate that we throw our kids together, and usually in schools that are structurally white anyway. Then they're all going to grow up and somehow have a notion of race that is completely in denial about how the world works. And that young people do not experience highly raced and marginal in very material ways what race is. And it's just the oldies who are romantic. No, I don't think so. I think a historical view, an honest view of how intimate, even in slavery, and I'm a scholar of slavery, even in conditions of slavery, intimacy was, right? And it was not antidote to violence. It often was opportunity to violence in ways that continue to haunt us in how we think about the world, and how we structure the world, and how we impact the world.
Okay, I only have two responses to Maralito's question. Look, the nation, and I think the South African state of all of the post-colonial or present African states, I think, is deeply racist and racialized, and has been created, whether or not you're going to view the power relations and the relations of domination through a race lens or through a class lens, it was structured in that way from the Dutch East India Company, whoever started mentioning it. And so, and dismantling that, and at various points in history, you then had the co-option, as you had in Namdali rights, of the existing forms of administration and organization of the varying groups in the country. And so to dismantle that is going to require not only, and I think the easiest thing in terms of dismantling it, or the one way that we'd all agree, or majority of the population would agree, of dismantling it, is attacking the bits of it that are racial, or the structure of it that's racialized. But the point is that in the 350 years or so of the South African state being developed, it's also become profoundly part of the way in which we identify ourselves. So people on either side of the border in Lesotho or in Swaziland or in Zimbabwe see themselves or identify themselves in terms of categories and characteristics that are actually false, so they were implanted or imposed, or in different parts of broader Tshwane area where I live. The ways in which people identify themselves are profoundly tied up in the falsehoods of the South African state building project. And so I agree there's a need to develop a new, I don't think that the South African state as it currently is going to be the future state. I'm just interested to see what the new formation is going to be. What of the organic, or what of what exists does the new formation come out of? Because I think that we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that that won't be a contested process. And also that won't be a process that leads to certain types of domination. And then just point interesting ways of how race is used in an analytical category, and I'll let Prof. Friedman answer that in his way, but if you look at the ways in which politics and political economy scholars in the UK are looking at the development of the UK economy as based on the profits from the slave trade. It's economic analysis, political economic analysis, but where race and white supremacy are fundamental analytical categories for explaining, for example, why when the Brits abolished slavery, they reimbursed the former slave owners and not the former slaves on plantations in the West Indies. And that then has formed the basis of the British financial industry. The city of London and finance is based primarily on the slave trade. Another person, Robbie Shilliam, who's written about race and the undeserving poor, so the construct of the white working class, and how that is founded primarily on notions of race and white supremacy, is a good place to look.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also just going to respond to Mr. Puri because he directs the questions at me. Yeah, just to add to that, I think it is important to use white supremacy as an analytical category, but not in an essentialist way. I mean, we're not trying to develop some kind of, somebody mentioned decolonization. I mean, a lot of my views at the moment, and I've written something on this recently on decolonization, are influenced by the Indian scholar Ashish Nandi, who in his book, The Intimate Enemy, I think, makes the very important point that the key to, one of the intellectual keys to colonization is essentialism, is creating this iron wall between superior cultures and inferior cultures, and that decolonization means liberating ourselves from this idea that there are hard and fast cultural boundaries which reinforce inequalities. But what I try to do it in a non-essentialist way, and in this book I keep on boring everybody with, which is on democratic theory. What I'm trying to argue there, just to give you an example of how this might work, is that the way in which we're encouraged to see democracy from a whole lot of quarters is actually a profoundly colonial understanding of democracy, and by implication a very racist understanding of democracy. I mean, I happen to argue, I'm a firm supporter of democracy, and I think that we can have alternative, decolonized, non-racial forms of democracy. But I think that unless you understand that a lot of the ways in which we're asked to think about democracy at the moment are really about being told that white folks in North America and Western Europe know how to do democracy, and the rest of us have to learn from them, then you don't really get a picture of what's actually going on. Your point about the state and Mamdani, I mean, it's interesting. We had this. There was a wonderful meeting at UWC where we debated with Mahmoud. And my argument there, which which hopefully, if the folks at UWC ever get their act together, would appear in print, is that Mamdani's view that our problem is that we've inherited key features of the state from the apartheid era, I think misses the point to a certain extent. I think what he's talking about is a symptom of something deeper. I find it very useful to understand South Africa over the last 25 years as a case of path dependence. And by that I mean that what Mamdani says about the state, we should actually be saying about the society. The problem is not that we still have a colonial apartheid. Well, I think colonial more than apartheid. It's not that we still have a colonial state, it's that we have a colonial society. And I think that if we start thinking about how we can have a society which is not colonial, then that may be the future state one is thinking of. The only point I do want to make before I hand back to the chair about my use of white supremacy as an analytical category, I do think with respect that it's a total falsehood and a caricature to suggest that those of us on this panel, and I think who are arguing that we ought to take race seriously, are only interested in discourse analysis rather than power. I mean, my understanding of white supremacy is very much that not only that it's an expression of power, but that the antidote is the use of counter-power to create alternative.
Okay. We are now at already 8 minutes to 5. We have to vacate the venue at 5, and there's traffic to fight. I'm going to make the, shall I say, autocratic decision that I will take one question from this side of the room. Now, we've taken that side of the room, we're now taking this side of the room. And Ntombovio, if you want to just, the young woman in front here. And please make it a 30-second question that they can answer.
Hi, my name is Tony Mendimande. I am a florist and I've had the privilege of being taught by Professor Kumlakola. I think mine is more of a provocation, and I was seduced by your question on how the possibility of the millennials of using race in languages that may have possible different meanings. And as an Achebian scholar, I think that it is possible for language to carry different meanings and for it to have different experiences. And I'll make a quick example about how slave queens, and because the question of power came up also, not just to make it a discursive argument, but also there was a moment where the term slay queens was used by women to like praise and give them power, and because patriarchy is patriarchy, like men just like took the shine. So I think that nuance in that instance is very important because it allows for negotiation of power, and we are able to think about power relations in different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask the panelists to give us their final wrap-up in literally 30 seconds each. Let's see if you can meet the 30-second challenge, because we then need to thank people so that they can also leave. Thank you.
This country is going nowhere. It's possibly going to crash unless there is a government that is serious about all manner of redistribution in this country.
I'm going to come next.
Yeah, quite. The race language isn't going anywhere, in as much as we may not think that it's useful analytically. And so, what can we do with it to achieve the kinds of emancipatory ends and redistribution that we clearly need as a country if we're not going to implode in the future?
Yeah, just to repeat and to expand, when we talk about the need to deal with race, redistribution matters, decolonization matters, the changes people want matter. The debate is about how you think about those changes and how you think about the antidote to those changes. And what we're saying is that if you ignore the fact that racial power is still a huge form of domination, just as male power is a huge form of domination for women. If you ignore that fact, then you miss the point and you will be unable to come up with antidotes.
I think if we're talking about elections and we're talking about remaking the society, I think that we all need to recognize that power is not just in the discursive, and the discursive is not just speaking, right? So to say things are discursive is not to say that they're not happening and being remade, as Tobile says, in a variety of ways. And I think that we need to pay attention, right? I think that we surrender our agency, that word, agency too much. And I think that, you know, as elections are coming, we like to speak as South Africans as though we are trapped in these categories. And so if we're saying race matters differently and we can make it matter differently, what does that mean? What are we doing? How do we do that? And how do we make ourselves less beholden to people who are using, and parties and structures that are using race in ways that no longer serve us or in ways that are not interesting to us? And I think we need to do that work. And we need to do the work of interrogating those and refusing. And I think we have many examples of that happening in this country. And so I think we need to pay attention to those.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to make one last closing remark and then thank people who make this possible. I'm reminded of the ideas expressed by Jane Coetzee in his 1987 Jerusalem Prize acceptance speech, where in diagnosing late apartheid South Africa, he says, so much of the yearning of the liberal white people of late apartheid South Africa was for a vision of the French Revolution's notions of liberté, égalité, fraternité, which is liberty, freedom, and brotherhood. But the yearning for brotherhood could only come with freedom and with equality. In post-apartheid South Africa, we tell ourselves, through metaphors like Born Free, that we have freedom. We certainly don't have equality in the most unequal society in the world. How can we imagine fraternité, or its non-gendered equivalent, a fellow feeling? And so our sentimental desire for getting along must transcend this notion of us just getting along without us also sharing along the resources. So race and racism have consequences around resource allocation. Some of those are intellectual, some of those are material.
And those have consequences for people's life chances. What I appreciate about all four of the panelists was their commitment to analysing this question in order to effect justice, to come to a greater sense of social, political, and economic justice for all South Africans. These are tough questions. These are going to require sacrifices. The pie is not increasing. In fact, resources in the world we live in are diminishing. And so this idea of how do we give more of something to some people inevitably results in having to ask the question that we avoid, which is what has to be taken from those who haven't. Because you can't share if you don't also take away. And some of that will be material, but a lot of it is also intellectual. And my concluding remark is to go back through the creative writers that this country have produced. I cited Coetzee, but I'd also like to cite two black writers, Zoe Wickham and Bessie Head, who argued repeatedly in their fiction, and in some of her essays Wickham does the same, that if we want to write another story for South Africa, we can't pretend that the old food that we've left in the fridge hasn't gone off, hasn't rotten, and hasn't in fact infected some of the other food that we keep putting in there. We may be needing to clean out our fridges. And here our fridges are our own minds, our own assumptions of what is right, about how to proceed, and to ask ourselves difficult questions. On that note, I'd like to thank the Market Theatre Foundation for giving us this venue and for partnering with ASWI, my colleagues at ASWI for assisting us in making this possible, particularly the research associates who've been walking around with microphones getting the catering. The catering will be on the deck, so if you go through the doors past the lift, you turn right, there will still be food there on tables. If you wish to engage with us, feel free to go onto our website, aswi.org.za, where you can have further engagements with us. As always, these things never last long enough, and yet they last too long. Yeah. We're all very tired at the end of 2 hours. No one wants to be here for 3 hours. Everybody wants to be here for 3 hours. This is the work that I'm making of this. I thank you so much for coming. Have a safe journey.
I get back to interesting through my own. When this challenge is on,